You spent your whole life learning how to survive. Not metaphorically, you became competent. You learned to handle yourself. You built a career. You navigated relationships. You became the person who could manage crisis. You became the person who didn't need much. You kept moving because stopping felt dangerous. You measured yourself by what you accomplished, not what you felt. And this worked. For 30 years, this worked beautifully. Then something shifted, not suddenly, slowly. Around 45, something changes for Gen X that nobody warns you about. It's not a crisis, though people call it that. It's a door opening in the middle of the life you've already built, and you realize you've been running toward a destination you no longer want to reach. This isn't about having less energy. This is about realizing that the metrics you've been using to measure your life don't measure anything real anymore. The achievement you built toward feels hollow. The status you accumulated feels like borrowed clothing. The relationships you maintained at a distance suddenly feel like the only thing that actually matters. And the time you thought you had infinite time reveals itself as finite. You were raised by parents who survived. They made it through recessions and divorces and wars and social shifts. Nobody prepared them for. They taught you, sometimes explicitly and often just by living in front of you, that you had to be ready for anything. That comfort was temporary, that relying on institutions was foolish, that you had to build your own foundation because no one else was going to hand you one. This created something in you, not weakness, resilience, that was actually self-reliance mixed with subtle fear. You learned early that emotions were a luxury people like you couldn't afford. If you were anxious, you channeled it into work. If you were sad, you kept moving. If you were lonely, you told yourself you preferred solitude anyway. You weren't repressed exactly. You were just trained to convert feeling into productivity, trained to interpret emotional need as weakness, trained to believe that if you just worked hard enough, achieved enough, accomplished enough, you'd finally feel secure. So you did. You became someone who could handle divorce, someone who could lose a job and find another, someone who could absorb criticism without flinching, someone who didn't demand much from others because you'd learned early that demand meant disappointment. You became someone who could be alone, someone who could be fine, someone who kept their needs small, so that losing things wouldn't hurt too badly. In your 20s and 30s, this was your superpower. While other people fell apart, you kept building. While they needed reassurance, you needed solutions. While they talked about feelings, you talked about system, strategy, and next steps. Your relationships worked because they weren't too close. Your career advanced because you didn't waste time on office politics or emotional processing. You were efficient. You were solid. You were the person people trusted in a crisis because you never became the crisis. Then you turned 45, and the wiring that saved you started electrocuting you. Instead, the first thing you notice is that you can seem to get excited about the next rung anymore. The promotion you thought you wanted feels arbitrary. The salary increase doesn't generate the hit of relief it used to. You realize you've been working toward a future that when you actually imagine yourself living in, it feels just as empty as today. You look around at the people who made it to the top of your industry, and something breaks a little. They're not happy, they're just busier. They've just found more sophisticated ways to avoid feeling. At the same time, your body starts keeping score, not dramatically, just enough. You can sleep the way you used to. You get injured in ways that take longer to heal. You notice your parents aging, and for the first time, you feel the weight of your own mortality sitting on your chest like an actual physical thing. Not morbid, just real. Your time is not unlimited. Your body is not a machine that will just keep running if you feed it enough coffee and ambition. So something has to give. And what gives is the ability to pretend anymore. You look at your relationships and realize they're full of space, physical closeness you've been maintaining at arm's length, conversations that stayed in the shallow end on purpose, people you've loved by showing up reliably but never by actually being present. And for decades, this felt like maturity. Not needing people seemed like strength. Being fine on your own seemed like freedom. Now it just seems lonely. You notice you're having thoughts like, I don't actually know if my partner really knows me. I wonder if my kids know that I actually like them, or if they just think I'm competent and distant. I've built a career I respect, but I have no idea what I actually want anymore. The person I've been for 40 years is really good at handling things, but I'm not sure she's actually living anything. This is the paradox that arrives at midlife for your generation. You spent all your energy becoming someone who didn't need anything, and now you're realizing that independence was never the goal. Connection was meaning, was the feeling of being actually known by another person, and you don't know how to do any of that because you've spent 45 years getting really, really good at not needing it. The thing nobody tells you is that this isn't a midlife crisis, it's a midlife reckoning. And reckonings are actually more useful than crises because they're telling you something true. What's changing isn't your value or your capacity. What's changing is what your nervous system will actually accept anymore. The emotional avoidance that once felt like capability now feels like numbness. The independence that once felt like freedom now feels like isolation. The achievement that once felt like proof of worth now feels like proof that you've been measuring the wrong things. You might notice you're having an unexpected emotional vulnerability that feels almost dangerous. You cry at things you wouldn't have cried at 5 years ago. You feel hurt from your relationships more acutely. You become aware of anxiety that you'd been intellectualizing for decades. This isn't weakness arriving. This is your actual emotional system finally surfacing after being submerged for so long. You didn't become softer. You just stopped managing everything through control. The research on midlife transition shows something interesting. The people who struggle most aren't those who had easy lives. They're the ones who built their identity entirely on achievement and self-reliance. Because when those stop working as a primary source of meaning, they have no other scaffold underneath them. They've been so busy becoming a person who doesn't need, they never learned to be a person who wants. This is where your generation has a specific burden. You were raised to distrust institution, to not need government safety nets, to build everything yourself because nobody was coming to save you. This created resourcefulness that was genuinely extraordinary, but it also created a kind of emotional self-sufficiency that became its own trap. You learn to handle crisis, you never learn to ask for closeness. You learn to solve problems, you never learn to simply be held in difficulty. And at 45, your body and your heart start demanding that you learn. What happens next matters. Some people recognize this as a signal and actually listen. They start telling their partners the truth about what they're feeling. They dial back the career scramble and invest in relationships they've been maintaining on autopilot. They start doing things just because they want to, not because they lead somewhere. They become slowly and somewhat awkwardly more human. Other people see this as a threat and double down. They push harder on the career, they restart the optimization cycle, they buy the thing, they leave the relationship. They tell themselves they just need to find a better strategy, a new goal, a different way to fill the space that suddenly became very loud and very empty. They interpret the reckoning as a problem to solve, not a message to listen to. The ones who listen seem to get happier, though, in a quieter way than they expected. Not manic happiness, just a quality of peace. They stop needing their achievements to prove their worth. They stop needing their independence to feel safe. They let their partners actually see them. They let their children know they're scared sometimes, too. They work, but they work differently. Not to escape themselves, to build something that has actual meaning. The hidden cost of the life you built before 45 is that you became really good at everything except aliveness itself. You became excellent at managing, you became terrible at wanting, you became brilliant at handling pressure, you became fragile in the face of gentleness, you became skillful at creating distance, you became uneasy with intimacy. That's not a character flaw, that was survival. Your generation got good at the things you needed to get good at given what you were shown about the world. But survival mode is not the same as living, and at 45, your nervous system is finally telling you that you're safe enough now to stop. Here's what changes when you actually believe that you stop optimizing and start choosing. You stop performing and start being. You stop measuring yourself against the person you thought you should become, and you start asking what the person you actually are might need. Your relationships get smaller but deeper. Your work becomes more selective but more meaningful. Your life becomes quieter but more real. This isn't about abandoning ambition or stability. Your generation built those things for good reasons, but you get to integrate them with the other part of being human that you put on pause. The part that needs people, the part that wants to be known, the part that finds meaning not just in what you've built, but in who you're building it with. The reckoning that hits at 45 isn't a sign that you did anything wrong for the first 45 years. It's actually a sign that you did exactly what you needed to do to survive. But survival was never the whole story. Your whole story includes success and connection, achievement and being seen, independence and belonging. And at this point in your life, you have finally built enough security to afford some of the softer things. Your nervous system is telling you that it's safe to let someone close, that it's possible to need people, that the strongest thing you can do now isn't to keep handling everything yourself, but to let yourself be handled a little. To be known to stop performing the version of yourself you think people need and let them meet the person you actually are. That's not a weakness that arrives at 45, that's wisdom that finally has room to breathe. If this resonates, subscribe, there's more like this coming.